The morning the horse auction ended, only one animal remained tied to the last weathered post. Its ribs showed through a faded bay coat. Its mane hung in uneven patches. One ear bore an old tear, and one hind leg rested just lightly enough against the dirt that everyone assumed the animal had already begun favoring it from permanent injury. The auctioneer sighed, removed his hat, and looked over the handful of ranchers still lingering around the dusty corral. $6, he called. Anybody? Nobody answered. A few men laughed quietly. One finally muttered, "Costs more to bury him." Another shook his head. "That horse won't last till first frost." Near the back of the crowd stood 28-year-old Martha Hale with a small leather purse holding exactly $12.40. Everything she owned fit inside a wagon parked beside the stock pens. 2 blankets, a cast-iron kettle, a sewing basket, a toolbox inherited from her father, and the folded deed to a neglected 60-acre homestead outside the newly settled valley of Juniper Basin, where sagebrush stretched between low pine-covered ridges, a winding creek threaded across open prairie, and the distant mountains held snow long after spring reached the grasslands below. She had spent 3 years caring for livestock on neighboring ranches after her father's passing. She had cleaned stalls before sunrise, delivered calves during snowstorms, and broken ice from water troughs every winter morning. She had very little money, but she had learned one habit that stayed with her. She never looked first at what an animal lacked. She watched what it still tried to do. The horse lowered its head toward a pile of scattered straw. Not hay, not grain, only straw dropped from wagon bedding. Instead of eating, it nosed through the pile carefully. Slowly, patiently, almost searching. Martha watched another minute. The horse ignored every dry stalk. Instead, it picked out tiny green shoots that had fallen from weeds mixed into the bedding. Fresh growth, tender stems. Only those. Its ears moved whenever someone stepped behind it. Its eyes remained bright, not frightened, alert. She noticed something else. The awkward hind leg wasn't dragged. Every few moments the horse shifted its weight naturally before resting again. Not a crippled gait. More like stiffness after standing too long. The old rancher beside her snorted. "Don't waste your money." Martha kept watching. The horse turned its head toward a nearby water barrel. It waited, patiently. It did not paw, did not pull, only watched. The auction hand finally noticed and carried over a bucket. The horse drank slowly, not desperately. Between swallows it lifted its head twice, breathing evenly before continuing. Not the frantic drinking of an animal dying from illness. The pattern settled quietly in Martha's thoughts. Weak, hungry, neglected, but careful, disciplined. Still thinking, she stepped forward. "I'll give 6. The auctioneer blinked. "You certain?" She nodded. "I am." Several men laughed aloud this time. One removed his cigar. "Ma'am, that horse is worth less than the rope around his neck." Another added, "You'd get more pulling your wagon yourself." Martha counted out $6 silver anyway. The receipt was folded into her pocket before anyone stopped smiling. The auctioneer handed her the worn lead rope. "Hope he surprises us." "So do I," Martha answered quietly. She did not ride the horse home. She walked beside him, nearly 14 miles, across rolling prairie where meadowlarks lifted from bunchgrass, past abandoned windmills squeaking against the afternoon breeze, along dusty wagon tracks where rabbitbrush glowed pale yellow beneath the August sun. The horse never once tried to pull ahead, nor did it fall behind. Whenever the trail climbed over rocky ground, Martha noticed something curious. The stiffness almost disappeared. On level ground it returned. She filed that observation away without speaking. By sunset they reached her neglected homestead. The cabin leaned slightly. Half the fence had collapsed. The barn roof needed shingles. Cottonwoods shaded a narrow creek that crossed one corner of the property before winding toward the valley below. The horse lifted its nose. Not toward the barn. Toward the creek. Again Martha simply watched. She untied him beside fresh water first. Only afterward did she spread hay. He drank, rested, then ate slowly, always in that order. Most hungry horses rushed food first. This one never did. That evening, lantern glowing softly inside the cabin. Martha unfolded an old notebook with empty pages. Not to record expenses. Not weather. Something else. Across the first page she wrote carefully. Horse signs. Beneath it she added simple observations. Walks better uphill. Chooses fresh weeds over dry straw. Drinks before eating. Listens behind him. Even breathing. No fever. She closed the notebook. The pages would become something only she understood. Not training notes. Not medical records. A book of movement. Every morning she would sketch simple footprints showing how the horse placed each hoof across different ground. Circles for pauses. Lines for longer strides. Tiny arrows whenever he favored one side. Over weeks the pages would become maps of recovery. Not measured with rulers. Measured by footsteps. She had learned long ago that a horse often told its story through its tracks long before its body showed change. The next morning dawn arrived wrapped in silver mist drifting from the creek. Sparrows filled the fence posts. Barn swallows skimmed low over dew-covered grass. Martha carried a bucket, a brush, and patience. She spent nearly an hour removing tangled hair and dried mud. Beneath the grime she discovered old harness sores that had healed poorly. The left shoulder carried thicker scar tissue than the right. That explained why certain movements appeared stiff. The hoof itself wasn't the beginning. The shoulder had forced the rest of the body to compensate. She smiled faintly. Another piece fit. Around midday her nearest neighbor arrived. His name was Owen Mercer, a broad-shouldered cattleman whose ranch bordered the southern pasture. He removed his hat politely before studying the horse. This the famous $6 bargain? So it seems. Owen walked around the animal once. You planning to work him? Eventually. He scratched his beard. I've seen better horses headed for the glue works. I've seen worse recover. He looked doubtful. You really believe that? I believe he hasn't quit. Owen laughed. Not cruelly, simply honestly. Sometimes determination isn't enough. No, Martha agreed. But sometimes understanding is. After he left, she turned the horse into a small pasture instead of the larger field. Not because grass was better. Because movement mattered. Too much grazing meant standing still. Too much walking meant exhaustion. She wanted steady wandering. Nothing forced. Nothing wasted. Each evening she followed the hoofprints with her notebook. Tiny sketches. Gentle curves. Long pauses beneath one cottonwood. Shorter pauses every passing day. Without realizing it, she was beginning to read the horse like other people read letters. September drifted across Juniper Basin with cooler nights and crisp winds carrying the scent of pine from the western ridges. Goldenrod bloomed along the creek. Aspen leaves shimmered in distant draws. The horse gained little weight. Certainly not enough for anyone passing by to notice. But Martha noticed smaller victories. His ears greeted birds before sunrise. His tail swatted flies with greater strength. He stepped farther into the creek instead of stopping at its edge. His shoulder muscles softened beneath daily brushing. One afternoon the valley blacksmith stopped while delivering horseshoes nearby. His name was Gilbert Shaw. He examined the horse's feet quietly. You've trimmed these yourself? I have. He nodded. Good balance. Then he frowned. Whoever owned him before left one front hoof too high for years. Martha opened her notebook. Could that force the shoulder? Gilbert smiled with surprise. You already suspected. I noticed. He looked again at the horse. Most folks stare at a lame leg. You watched the whole body, he said. She simply nodded. Gilbert adjusted the hoof slightly before refusing payment. Call it an investment. In the horse? In the woman paying attention. That evening Martha copied another page into her notebook. The footprints changed again. The circles where the horse had paused beneath the cottonwoods grew fewer. The stride between sketches stretched just a little farther. Small changes. Almost invisible. Unless someone had watched every single day. By October, people passing the homestead had stopped laughing quite so loudly. They still smiled. Still shook their heads. But they no longer called the horse dead. Instead they wondered why it seemed just a little stronger each week. No one could quite explain it. Martha could. though even she knew the real work had only begun. She stood at the pasture fence beneath a sky glowing orange behind the mountains. The horse lifted its head from grazing and walked toward her without being called. Not quickly, not dramatically, steadily. Each hoof landed with quiet confidence across the autumn grass. She watched every step before opening her notebook one more time. Then she drew the longest, smoothest trail of footprints yet. And the next morning, before the valley had finished whispering about the foolish woman who wasted half her savings on a starving ranch horse, she made another decision that surprised everyone. She removed the old rope halter forever and began teaching the horse to trust her without needing to be tied. By the first hard frost, Martha had learned that the horse did not fear people so much as he feared being trapped by them. A hand approaching his face caused no alarm. A blanket lifted over his back made him tense but remained still. Yet the moment a rope tightened against his jaw, his breathing changed. His neck stiffened. His left shoulder rose. The old uneven step returned before he had even begun to move. That was why she removed the halter. Not because she believed affection could replace training, and not because she imagined the horse would simply choose obedience. She removed it because she had begun to understand that the rope itself had become part of his injury. For 3 mornings she asked nothing of him. She entered the small pasture carrying a shallow wooden pan of oats and stood near the gate while pale mist drifted over the creek. Frost silvered the fence rails. Prairie hens moved through the grass in soft brown clusters, and the eastern mountains caught the first amber light. The horse watched her. He did not approach. Martha placed the pan on the ground and stepped back. After several minutes, he came. Not directly. He circled once, stopped beside the cottonwood, then crossed the last few yards with his nose low. Martha opened her notebook that evening and drew a simple shape unlike the hoof maps she had made before. A square for the gate, a circle for the tree, a line showing the horse's path. The next morning, she repeated the exercise. This time the circle was smaller. On the 5th morning, the horse walked straight to the pan. That was the beginning of Martha's new method. She called it the distance ledger. Each day, she recorded how far the horse would willingly follow her without rope, pressure, or feed held in front of him. She marked the distance by landmarks around the homestead. Gate to cottonwood, cottonwood to trough, trough to barn, barn to creek bend. No whips, no chasing, no sudden demands. Only one clear invitation at a time. At first, the work seemed foolish even to those who had stopped laughing. Owen Mercer leaned against the fence one afternoon while Martha walked slowly across the pasture with the horse following several paces behind. "You planning to take him somewhere?" Owen asked. "Or are you both just studying the same patch of dirt?" Martha stopped near the trough. The horse stopped too. "I'm teaching him to move without expecting pain." Owen glanced at the empty rope peg beside the barn. "He'll need tack eventually." "Yes. Then why avoid it now?" "Because if he learns that every step toward me ends with restraint, he'll stop coming." Owen considered that. His own methods were not cruel. He had raised cattle and horses all his life, and he understood patience better than most men in Juniper Basin. Still, he believed an animal improved through steady use. Martha believed this one needed to understand choice before he could accept work. "Seems slow," he said. "It is." "How slow?" "As slow as he needs." Owen smiled faintly. That answer would make most ranchers restless. Most ranchers did not buy him. She resumed walking. The horse followed her past the trough. That evening she added another line to the ledger. Gate to trough without hesitation. The first failure came 2 weeks later. Gilbert Shaw had repaired an old lightweight saddle for her, replacing the cracked cinch strap and padding the underside with felt. Martha set it on the fence where the horse could see it. For days she carried it near him without placing it on his back. She let him smell the leather. She rubbed his shoulder with the folded blanket. She lifted and lowered the saddle beside him until the motion no longer made his ears tighten. When she finally rested it across his back, he stood quietly. Martha almost smiled. Then the cinch buckle clicked. The horse exploded sideways. He struck the fence with one hip, spun, and ran the length of the pasture before turning sharply near the creek. The saddle slipped beneath his belly. Leather flapped against his ribs. Martha did not chase him. She opened the pasture gate and stood still. The horse made 2 panic circles. Then he stopped, sides heaving. "Easy," she said. Her voice carried no command, only steadiness. She waited until he looked at her. Then she backed away from the gate. The horse came through on trembling legs. It took nearly an hour to remove the saddle without frightening him again. That evening, Martha sat at the cabin table with lantern light warming the notebook pages. She could hear wind pressing against the roof and loose branches scratching softly along the eaves. She did not write failure. She wrote metal sound before panic. Then, beneath it, she added pressure beneath ribs worse than weight across back. The next morning she asked Gilbert to visit. He examined the saddle while Martha described what happened. "Could be the buckle," he said. "Could be. Could be the cinch. That too." Gilbert turned the strap over in his hands. "What are you thinking?" "That someone may have tightened him hard before he was ready. Plenty of men do. Hard enough to leave memory." Gilbert's expression changed. He looked toward the pasture where the horse stood beside the frozen creek. "You want a silent fastening? I want something that tightens gradually." Together, they designed a broad woven girth with wooden toggles instead of a metal buckle. It spread pressure across more of the horse's ribs and could be adjusted 1 notch at a time without sudden noise. Martha paid him 50 cents. He tried to refuse. She placed the coin on his anvil. "Work deserves payment. So does good sense," he said. "Then we are even." The cold deepened through November. Juniper Basin turned brown and silver beneath restless skies. Wind rushed down from the mountains, bending dead grass in long waves. The orchard near the old schoolhouse lost its last leaves. Ice formed along the creek edges, and cattle gathered in low ground where cottonwoods broke the weather. Martha's money shrank. Feed cost more than she expected. A section of barn roof tore loose during a night storm, and she spent 2 days repairing it with salvaged boards. Her gloves split at the palms. Her boots leaked. Once, after counting coins beside the lantern, she realized she could afford either flour for herself or linseed meal for the horse. She bought the linseed meal. For 4 days she ate beans, dried apples, and cornbread made from the last of her meal sack. She did not consider herself noble. She considered it an agreement. She had purchased a starving animal. That made his recovery her responsibility. Still, recovery did not come smoothly. Some mornings he followed her from gate to barn. Other mornings he stopped at the cottonwood and refused to move farther. On windy days, old fear returned. If a board slammed, he flinched. If leather dragged across wood, he backed away. Martha never punished the retreat. She simply shortened the distance. The ledger became crowded with marks. Straight lines for calm movement. Broken lines for hesitation. Crosses where fear returned. Small stars beside new successes. The method helped her see what memory alone might have hidden. The horse did better after drinking. He did worse when hungry. He moved freely in cold weather but stiffened after standing in damp ground. He accepted the saddle blanket more easily from the left side, but the girth more easily from the right. Most importantly, he relaxed faster when allowed to see every object before it touched him. So Martha stopped training in the narrow barn aisle. She worked outside where he could turn his head. She placed tools on the ground before using them. She let him watch the entire process. By December, the distance ledger showed steady change. Gate to trough, trough to barn, barn to creek, creek to the low rise beyond the orchard. No rope, no feed reward every time. Sometimes only Martha's hand resting briefly against his neck. The first undeniable proof came on a gray morning after snow. Owen Mercer arrived before sunrise with worry in his face. One of his calves had broken through thin ice along a shallow side channel of the creek. The mother stood nearby, bawling and charging anyone who approached. Owen had brought 2 men, but the frozen bank was too narrow for a wagon and too slick for a frightened saddle horse. Martha looked toward her bay. "He has never pulled weight," Owen warned. "He does not need to pull much. He has never been ridden." "He will not be ridden." She fitted the broad woven girth around the horse's body and attached a long rope through a padded breast strap Gilbert had made from old harness leather. The horse tensed. Martha waited. Snow drifted from the barn roof in soft powder. The calf cried weakly from the creek. The mother's hooves struck frozen earth. Martha placed her hand against the bay's shoulder. "Only a few steps," she said. She led him toward the creek. He followed. At the bank, the rope was fastened around the calf beneath its chest. Owen and the two men pushed from below while Martha asked the horse to walk forward. For one moment he braced. The old stiffness returned. Then he lowered his head, leaned into the breast strap, and took one careful step. Then another. The calf slid over the ice edge and onto solid ground. The mother rushed forward, licking its face while the men stepped away. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Owen looked at the horse, then at Martha. $6 had not purchased a useless animal. It had purchased one that still understood how to listen, how to balance, and how to give strength carefully when asked. Owen removed his hat. "Well," he said quietly, "that horse just earned more than his price." Martha rubbed the bay's neck as his breath steamed in the winter air. "No," she answered. "He only proved he was never what people thought." That night, beneath the warm glow of the lantern, she opened the distance ledger and drew a line longer than any before it, from the pasture gate to the frozen creek. Beside it she placed a single star. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods, and in the dark barn the $6 horse stood calmly beneath his first properly fitted harness. Winter loosened its grip one slow day at a time. By late March, narrow ribbons of water ran beneath the melting snow along Juniper Basin. The creek swelled with clear mountain runoff, meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, and the first green shoots pushed through the prairie where only weeks before the ground had seemed lifeless. The bay horse had changed enough that strangers no longer recognized him. His ribs no longer showed beneath his coat. The dull hair had been replaced by a deep reddish-brown sheen that caught the morning light. His shoulders had broadened. His neck carried itself naturally, and the old stiffness appeared only after long hours of standing. Martha still refused to rush him. Every sunrise began almost exactly the same. She opened the pasture gate. She stood quietly beside the weathered fence. The horse chose to walk toward her. Only then did the day's work begin. The distance ledger continued to grow, but now it included something new. Instead of measuring only how far the horse would willingly follow, Martha began recording how quickly he recovered after difficult work. She timed his breathing by counting heartbeats against her own wrist. She noted how long it took before his ears relaxed. She watched whether he lowered his head to graze immediately or stood thinking before eating. It was another form of observation, not how much effort the horse could give, how wisely he used it. Gilbert Shaw often stopped by after finishing work at the blacksmith shop. One afternoon he watched the horse drag a smooth cedar log across the pasture. The load itself was light. The lesson was not strength. It was balance. Instead of pulling in a straight line, Martha asked the horse to make gentle curves around wooden stakes she had placed across the field. Gilbert folded his arms. "I've never seen anyone teach a ranch horse to pull like that. I'm not teaching pulling. No, I'm teaching him to think before he leans." Gilbert watched another turn. The horse slowed slightly before every curve, shifted his weight, and then eased the log around the stake without jerking the harness. Gilbert murmured. "Most horses learn force. He'll need judgment. Why? Because someday someone will ask him to pull something heavier than expected." Gilbert smiled. "You always seem to be preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. The land usually tells us before people do." The old blacksmith looked toward the mountains where lingering snow still rested on the higher peaks. He nodded quietly. She was right more often than anyone cared to admit. Spring rains arrived gently. Wildflowers spread across the hillsides. Apple trees in the abandoned orchard near the schoolhouse burst into pale blossoms, and the valley carried the scent of damp earth instead of dust. People passing the Hale homestead slowed their wagons now. Not to laugh, to watch. Children leaned over wagon rails to see the horse calmly pulling logs, crossing shallow creeks, or waiting patiently while Martha adjusted the harness. Questions replaced jokes. What do you feed him? How old is he? Where'd you buy that broad girth? How'd you cure the limp? Martha answered honestly. There wasn't one cure, only many small ones. Some listened. Some hurried away before hearing the rest. Mrs. Agnes Holloway, the schoolteacher, listened the longest. She visited one Saturday carrying a basket of fresh bread. I think, she said, people like easy answers. There usually aren't any. They'd rather hear you found special medicine. I found time. The teacher smiled. Children disliked that answer too. They laughed together while birds sang from the cottonwoods. By early May another visitor arrived. His name was Vernon Pike. He owned the largest livestock brokerage between Juniper Basin and the railroad town of Alder Flats. Everything about him suggested success. Fine boots, pressed coat, silver watch chain, a polished wagon pulled by matched chestnut horses. He watched Martha working for nearly half an hour before introducing himself. I hear this is the famous $6 horse. So people say, I'll offer you 100. Martha continued brushing the horse's shoulder. He isn't for sale. Vernon chuckled. Everything has a price. Not everything. 125. No. The broker circled the horse carefully. He isn't special. I agree. That answer surprised him. No? He's simply been understood. Vernon frowned. Understanding doesn't pay ranch taxes. Keeps horses alive. He climbed back into his wagon. You'll regret refusing. Martha simply wished him safe travels. Gilbert, who had witnessed the conversation from his wagon nearby, shook his head afterward. That's more money than some folks see in 2 years. I know. You never considered it? I considered what happens after. What happens? He belongs to someone who wants profit more than patience. Gilbert looked toward the horse quietly grazing beside the creek. I suppose that's answer enough. Summer arrived with unusual heat. By June, prairie grass browned earlier than expected. Creeks shrank. Dust lingered behind every wagon. Even old Owen Mercer admitted he had never seen the valley dry so quickly. His cattle began walking farther every day in search of water. The smaller ponds disappeared first. Then the marshes. The hills lost their spring color almost overnight. One evening several ranchers gathered outside the general store. Voices carried concern rather than complaint. If July stays this hot, we'll have to move the herds. South pastures already bare. The creeks falling every week. Old Mrs. Barlow, who owned the store, looked toward Martha. You've been watching that horse every day. Martha nodded. Have you noticed anything? She hesitated. I've noticed he keeps choosing the western draw. The one below Pine Bluff? Yes. Owen frowned. There's barely a trail there. I know. He goes anyway? Every afternoon. Looking for shade? I don't think so. That night Martha opened the distance ledger again. The newer pages contained another habit she had quietly begun recording. Not just where the horse traveled, where he preferred to stop grazing. Tiny arrows pointed toward the western hills almost every afternoon. She spread the notebook across the table. The pattern repeated itself nearly 20 times. Always west. Always near the same ridge. The next morning she saddled the horse before sunrise. This time she rode him. It was only the 4th ride they had ever taken together. He moved calmly beneath her. Not hurried. Not uncertain. Simply steady. They crossed dry prairie. Followed a narrow deer trail. Climbed through scattered juniper. Birdsong echoed across the rocky slopes. Halfway up the western draw, the horse lifted his head. Without instruction he turned slightly north. Martha loosened the reins. She trusted his choice. A quarter-mile later they reached a cluster of cottonwoods, hidden inside a shallow fold of land. Beneath them flowed a narrow spring. Not large, but steady. Crystal-clear water emerged directly from fractured stone before disappearing beneath tall grass. The place could not be seen from the valley below. Years of brush had hidden it completely. The horse drank quietly, then stood watching her. Martha knelt beside the spring. She dipped her hands into the cold water. The flow remained constant despite the drought. Not enough for every ranch in Juniper Basin, but enough to water exhausted cattle traveling across the western range. She smiled softly, not because she had discovered something magical, because she finally understood why the horse had chosen this place day after day. Long before the ponds had vanished, he had sensed cooler ground, greener grass, moist air. He had remembered water where people remembered only dry trails. That evening she returned to town. The ranchers listened carefully. Some doubted. Others followed her the next morning. By noon, wagons had cleared the overgrown approach. Small stone basins were built to slow the water. Wooden troughs carried overflow into temporary holding pools. The hidden spring became a resting place for livestock crossing the western prairie. It did not end the drought, but it bought valuable time. For several weeks the valley breathed easier. People no longer spoke only about Martha. They spoke about the horse. Children began calling him Old Scout. The name spread naturally until even Martha found herself using it. Then came troubling news. A large cattle drive from farther north was expected to pass through Juniper Basin in early August. Nearly 800 head. If the drought continued, there would not be enough water along the traditional trail. Several ranchers feared the herd would scatter searching for moisture. Others worried the exhausted cattle would destroy what little pasture remained. At the evening meeting inside the schoolhouse, voices rose with concern. We should turn them away. They'll ruin every grazing field. They've nowhere else to go. Silence settled. Finally Owen looked toward Martha. You've watched this valley closer than any of us. What would you do? She thought for a long moment, then looked toward the open window where warm wind carried the scent of dry sage. The horse found one spring. She said quietly, the land may still have another answer. Outside, beneath the fading light of sunset, Old Scout stood beside the hitching rail with ears turned toward the western hills, as though he too were already listening for whatever challenge the coming summer would bring. The August sun rose red through a veil of dust. Long before daylight reached the valley floor, Martha was already saddling Old Scout beneath the quiet glow of the barn lantern. The horse stood calmly while she fastened the broad woven girth that Gilbert had helped design months before. Every buckle was checked by hand. Every strap rested exactly where it should. She had learned that haste often disguised itself as confidence. This morning allowed neither. By mid-morning, a low brown cloud appeared on the northern horizon. It was not weather. It was the cattle drive. Nearly 800 longhorns drifted southward across the prairie, their horns catching flashes of sunlight as riders worked patiently along both flanks. The sound reached Juniper Basin before the herd itself did. Thousands of hooves, creaking leather, distant whistles, and the constant murmuring calls of tired cattle. The trail boss introduced himself as Samuel Briggs. He looked as weathered as an old cottonwood. His beard carried more gray than brown, and deep lines crossed his face from years beneath open skies. We were told there was water here, he said. There is, Owen answered, but not enough for every head if they're brought in all at once. Samuel removed his hat. I feared as much. He unfolded a worn trail map across the hood of his wagon. Our next dependable river is nearly 30 miles south. In this heat, Owen replied, you'll lose cattle before sunset. Silence settled around the group. Every rancher knew it. Every drover knew it. The drought had already shortened grazing, and exhausted cattle made poor decisions. If they smelled water beyond the trail, they would spread in every direction. Once a herd scattered across dry prairie, gathering it again could take days. Martha studied the map only briefly before looking instead toward the land itself. Old Scout had already lifted his nose. His ears pointed west, exactly as they had each afternoon during the drought. Not toward the hidden spring. Farther beyond it, she noticed something else. The morning breeze came steadily from the southwest, yet a faint ribbon of cooler air brushed across her face from another direction. Almost too slight to notice. Almost. She crouched and touched the ground. The dust nearest the wagon was hot. A few yards farther west it felt slightly cooler beneath the surface. Not wet, only cooler. Old Scout pawed once, then stood still again. Martha remembered every page of her notebook. The horse never pawed from impatience. Only when uncertain, or when he detected something beneath him, she stood. "I'd like to ride west." Samuel looked puzzled. "The water's this way." "I know. I think there's another crossing." "No trail shows one. The land doesn't always mark its best paths." Several men exchanged doubtful glances. Vernon Pike, who had returned to Juniper Basin hoping to purchase livestock from anxious ranchers during the drought, folded his arms. "You'd gamble 800 cattle on a feeling?" Martha answered calmly. "Not a feeling." She placed her hand on Old Scout's neck. "An observation." Samuel studied the horse. Then Martha. He had spent 40 years on cattle trails. He recognized certainty when it came from pride. This was different. She looked only quietly convinced. Finally he nodded. "You've earned enough trust from these folks. We'll look." A small group rode ahead. Martha, Samuel, Owen, 2 drovers. Gilbert followed in a wagon carrying tools. Old Scout walked at the front without needing direction. They crossed the hidden spring, then continued into rougher country where scattered junipers clung to rocky slopes. The trail narrowed between low sandstone ridges before opening onto rolling grassland few people entered because it appeared to lead nowhere. The air changed. Not dramatically, just enough that Martha noticed birds flying lower than usual. Red-winged blackbirds gathered along a distant line of reeds. Where reeds survived in late summer, moisture often lay beneath. Old Scout turned again, this time without hesitation. The riders followed. Half a mile later the ground dipped into a broad natural swale, hidden from the main valley by rising hills. There, beneath tall grasses and willow thickets, flowed an old abandoned stream channel. Most of the surface had dried years before, but underground water still moved through gravel beneath the soil. In one place the bank had collapsed after spring runoff, exposing a clear flowing side channel nearly 20 feet wide. Samuel stared in disbelief. "I've crossed this country 20 times. So have I," Owen admitted. "I never saw it." "You couldn't," Martha said. The brush was thicker before the drought. The lowered grass had revealed what wetter years concealed. Gilbert stepped into the stream. Strong current. Samuel knelt beside the water. Cold. Clean. Enough flow to water cattle steadily if handled properly. The problem was the steep banks. Thousands of hooves would turn them into mud within an hour. Again Martha watched rather than rushed. She studied the slope. One side carried scattered flat stones. The other ended in clay. She pointed toward the rocky bank. "We'll bring them down here. And out there." She indicated a gradual grassy rise farther downstream. No sharp turns. No crowding. Samuel smiled. "You're already running my cattle drive. Only helping your horses." The next 6 hours became the hardest work Juniper Basin had seen in years. Gilbert directed men placing stones across the muddy approach. Owen organized ranch hands to cut willow branches and strengthen the banks. Mrs. Holloway arrived with older schoolchildren carrying buckets and shovels. Mrs. Barlow sent bread, smoked beef, and barrels of drinking water. Even Vernon Pike climbed down from his polished wagon without being asked. No one mentioned profits. No one argued about ownership. The drought had reminded everyone that survival belonged to communities before it belonged to individuals. As evening approached, the first section of the cattle drive entered the crossing. Old Scout stood beside Martha at the entrance. Not pulling, not pushing, watching. Whenever nervous cattle hesitated at the unfamiliar bank, Martha moved Old Scout forward a few quiet steps. The horse never lunged, never snapped at them. His calmness spread through the lead animals. Cattle trusted steady movement more readily than loud commands. The first 100 crossed safely. Then another 100. Dust hung golden beneath the lowering sun. The air filled with splashing water, lowing cattle, creaking saddles, and the steady calls of drovers guiding the herd. Halfway through the crossing, trouble came. A sudden gust swept down the valley. One canvas supply wagon tipped against a hidden rock. Barrels rolled free. The frightened team jerked sideways. Several lead cattle swung sharply toward the muddy bank instead of the stone crossing. Samuel shouted, Drovers raced to block them. Too late. The first animals began climbing the soft bank. If enough followed, hundreds would bog down together. The entire drive could panic. Martha looked only once. Then she loosened Old Scout's reins. The bay understood before she spoke. He trotted ahead, not at the cattle, but across their line of sight. Not fast enough to frighten them, just steadily enough to become something worth following. His ears remained forward. His head stayed low. His stride never changed. Led cattle shifted toward him. Then another row followed. Then another. Instead of forcing the herd away from danger, Old Scout quietly gave them a better direction. Samuel immediately understood. Leave him room. The drovers opened a narrow lane. Old Scout crossed the stone approach exactly as he had practiced for months while pulling cedar logs around wooden stakes. Every careful turn, every balanced step, every pause before changing direction. The cattle followed him naturally. The entire front of the herd curved back toward solid footing. Within minutes, the dangerous pressure on the muddy bank disappeared. The wagon was righted. The crossing resumed. Only after the last steer reached the opposite pasture did anyone truly understand what had happened. Samuel removed his hat. So that's how he saved the drive. Martha smiled gently. He remembered what we taught together. No. Samuel shook his head. You remembered what he was trying to teach you. Those words stayed with everyone standing there. Because they were true. The horse had not become extraordinary through miracles. He had become dependable because someone had paid attention long enough to understand him. By early autumn, the rains finally returned. Soft at first, then steady. The prairie greened once more. Grass rose across hills that had seemed hopeless only weeks before. The hidden spring and the old stream crossing remained open, maintained jointly by every ranch in Juniper Basin. Stone approaches replaced muddy banks. Willow roots strengthened the soil. Travelers watered livestock there for years afterward. Children often asked why the crossing was called Scout's Ford. Older folks simply smiled. Because one horse noticed the land before the rest of us did. The name stayed. Vernon Pike visited once more before winter. This time he carried no offer. Instead, he handed Martha a new leather notebook. I suppose you'll fill this one too. She accepted it with quiet gratitude. I will. I was wrong. She looked at him. You weren't the only one. He laughed softly. No, I imagine I wasn't. Gilbert continued shoeing horses, though many owners now asked him to trim hooves the way Martha preferred. Owen changed how he introduced young horses to harness, giving them time to understand before asking them to work. Mrs. Holloway began teaching her students that careful observation mattered as much as quick answers. Even Samuel Briggs altered future cattle drives, training lead horses to guide calmly rather than forcefully. Old Scout never became the fastest horse in Juniper Basin, nor the strongest. He never won races, never carried famous riders. He simply worked, year after year, steady, reliable, wise, exactly the kind of horse every ranch quietly hoped to own. One October evening, several years after the auction where laughter had followed $6 silver, Martha stood beside the same weathered pasture fence where her mornings always began. Mist drifted above the creek. Birds settled into the cottonwoods. Autumn leaves turned slowly in the evening breeze. Old Scout, now gray around his muzzle, lifted his head from grazing and walked toward her without being called, just as he always had. She rested one hand against his neck while the last sunlight warmed the prairie. Neither of them had become wealthy. Neither had sought attention. Yet because one patient woman had looked beyond ribs, scars, and a $6 price tag, an entire valley had learned to watch the land more carefully, to handle their animals more thoughtfully, and to trust that quiet observation could accomplish what force so often could not. Years earlier, everyone had seen a starving ranch horse waiting to be forgotten beside the last auction post. Now, when evenings settled across Juniper Basin and cattle moved safely through Scout's Ford beneath the watch of weathered cottonwoods, people remembered something entirely different. Sometimes the greatest worth is found only by the one person willing to look long enough to see it.